Picking up immediately from where the previous video installation had left off at, as the general conditions and circumstances of the unfolding battle in the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space had been laid out by 6 a.m. as by 5 a.m., the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade had landed all of its comprising battalions ashore in this battle space, and many pivotal key operations were now unfolding to pursue the various objectives laid out in the war plan. As the Light Combined Arms Battalion had many objectives to capture that were no less important than the others being pursued throughout the battle space, which included, among others, the capture intact of the Entergy Sabine power plant, which in fact, although critical to American national security, as this gas-burning power plant was directly responsible for powering the local area, which included the military logistical port facilities in the Beaumont port, the area was lightly defended by a contingent of 150 American alphabet paramilitary forces that were kitted out in U.S. Army attire, which included their fatigues, their Kevlar helmets, and body armor. They were also equipped with slightly heavier weaponry, which included M250 cal machine guns, which had been diligently placed in recently prepared perimeter defenses consisting of sandbag emplacements, which included the heavy machine gun emplacements around the perimeter of the Entergy Sabine power plant. As the Light Combined Arms Battalion comprised of 8 companies, which included its headquarters and support company, which were its command and logistical elements, as well as also its combat engineer company, its 82 millimeter mortar company, which were its fire support assets that were baked into the battalion, so to speak, as well as also 5 amphibious marine infantry companies. Out of these 8 companies, the Combat Engineer Company, with its very capable and specialized equipment, which included a complement of drone operators with both the very surgical FPV drones and also the CH-901A loitering munitions in their single tube versions. They also, of course, had their robotic forces, which included armed combat robots with 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, as well as unarmed quad-legged robots with arms which could plant or remove demolition charges and or obstacles. As also, they had their track-based DJI disposable demolition drone or robots that were track-based. These would end up not being utilized in the capture of the Entergy Sabine power plant, as each carrying 4 pounds of C4 demolition charges were deemed too devastating to utilize to seize control of the power plant, although the vehicle-based capabilities of the combat engineers, which included their armored engineering vehicles, the GSL-130s, would also be utilized in a very limited manner, as in only in certain cases on the outer perimeter defenses, as the vehicles would smash through the flimsy chain link fencing. The dismounted combat engineers would race into the facility and begin to clear the facility of any and all defending forces. The capture of the power plant itself would occur in very short order, as this would be a very rapid, albeit methodical, surgical, and precise operation being carried out by the combat engineers of the Light Combined Arms Battalion, as the Combat Engineer Company, between 5 and 6 a.m., had peeled off the main body of the battalion's comprising elements and raced for the Entergy Sabine power plant. The remaining 7 companies of the battalion advanced north and into Orange, as the headquarters and support company, the 82 millimeter mortar company, and one of the 5 amphibious marine infantry companies would take a position in the local municipal airport. as the headquarters and support company would command the operation and also conduct logistical operations from within this objective, as the airport would be captured without a fight. The one remaining amphibious marine infantry company would provide perimeter defenses, as the 82 millimeter mortar company would take up positions in the far northeast corner of the airport and would from there be able to cover most of the city of Orange with its mortar fire, as it also, besides standard ammunition, had extended range 82 millimeter mortar ammunition, which was rocket assisted, and thus was able to cover the entirety of the battle space. As the four remaining Marine Amphibious Infantry companies of the Light Combined Arms Battalion would continue advancing north and into Orange. One company would advance on the outer edges of the city in the west. Two would travel through the heart of the city, all advancing towards I-10, and one in the far east of the city along the Sabine River to capture the I-10 Sabine River Bridge, which was the literal and figurative gateway into the southeastern invasion sector from the south central invasion sector. As the I-10 route was a critical key invasion route, the I-10 highway through this particular battle space would need to be brought under complete and total PLAN Marine control, as the external invasion components, according to fourth generation warfare doctrines traveling along key invasion routes, would need to travel through nodes that were completely under control of friendly forces, as normally Trojan shock armies would carry out these objectives. In this particular battle space, the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade was technically an external invasion component, as it conducted beach landings and did not originate on any CCP regime properties, at least within this particular battle space, as the Marines were now carrying out similar operations to what the Trojans were in other invasion sectors. The capture of the critical node of Orange, now being conducted by the Light Combined Arms Battalion, would meet with armed civilian resistance as well as also paramilitary defenders trying to resist the capture of the Entergy Sabine Power Plant headquarters complex. As the four companies advancing north would reach their objectives by 6 a.m., whereby, at least in the heart of the city, the major combat would ensue, the grouping of just over 200 armed reactionary civilians that originated in Orange had mostly fled north, where they tried to regroup along I-10 and would soon be joined by a contingent of armed reactionary civilian militia forces numbering just over 200 as well, as these armed civilian militia elements were generally better armed, more disciplined, and better trained than the disorganized, ragtag, standard armed reactionary civilians. These forces had effectively, again, as mentioned many times, come together as a direct result of the immigration crisis, as there were many different types of so-called immigrants that had showed up on American shores, including criminal elements such as gangs and others that had been causing immense trouble throughout the land, and many militias had formed as a direct response to the security challenges brought to the nation by these types of criminal elements. As the armed militias were, again, somewhat organized on a logistical basis and had standardized weaponry so that they could stockpile ammunition that would be common throughout their elements, the command and control elements of these militia forces, although relatively primitive, still at least existed to where they were quasi-organized forces, as they, due to the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare jamming, had no access to long-range communications such as radio, and had no ISR capabilities, as their drones would not work every bit as the military and paramilitary drones would not work in these environments. They could only use scouts for ISR gathering purposes to gather intelligence, and also runners for spreading communications at longer distances, as these forces had been informed of the sightings of the PLAN Marine forces landing on American shores by travelers and refugees that were now fleeing from the devastating combination of airstrikes, cruise missile strikes on local bridges from the sea, and also more now that the PLAN artillery had come ashore, as their artillery battalion of PLZ-07 122mm howitzers was now engaged in constant artillery barrages, especially against the Vidor area and Beaumont City, as well as also to the southwest of the city, in support of the two air assault infantry Marine companies holding the I-10 bridge to the southwest of Beaumont. The Light Combined Arms Battalion that was capturing objectives in Orange and at the Entergy Sabine power plant, although they would not receive this very powerful artillery support, would in lieu of this receive extremely potent air support from the Russian VVS Su-34 strike aircraft, which would more than make up for the discrepancy of not having any artillery support, as well as also having available the J-10 fighters that could now conduct precision strikes in support of the ground forces, as now no longer were there any air threats from American air power, as between 5 and 5:30 a.m., the last remaining vestiges of American air power of the USAF, U.S. Navy Aviation, and U.S. Marine Corps Aviation had by now been all but completely wiped out. And in short order, the J-10 fighter squadrons, as there were two fighter squadrons of J-10s allocated just to this battle space, would be conducting an RTB to rearm with predominantly air-to-ground munitions, as they would trade in their air-to-air munitions for air-to-ground munitions, with the exception of a pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles on each wingtip, as this was standard operating procedure, despite the fact that, again, there was no air threat from the Americans by this time. As the fighters were due to leave shortly, the operations now unfolding inside of the city of Orange would see the PLAN Marines advance through the city and conduct small-scale engagements en route, as they would be fired upon by small groupings of standard armed reactionary civilians who would either stand and fight and would perish for it, or they would attempt to conduct small-scale hit-and-run attacks that would effectively, mostly, completely fail, as the PLAN Marines had all of their quadcopter assets deployed and mapping the area in real time in conjunction with the high-altitude ISR capabilities from the high-altitude recon drones and the satellite-based ISR capabilities of the coalition. There was effectively nowhere that these Americans could run to and hide, apart from perhaps going underground in some places, as anything that was out in the open could be and was absolutely seen and was plotted on the combat data link maps in real time. As defending forces mustered and clustered together, they were seen and mapped in real time. As they moved, they were seen and mapped in real time, and as they were destroyed, they were removed from the combat data link maps in real time. The squad-level NCOs, of course, had their handheld PDA forms of the combat data links, while the vehicles also had their own combat data links, and each and every vehicle crew and dismounted squad had their own quadcopter asset. And with hundreds of quadcopter assets now roving and running circuits throughout the entire battle space, Everything was now being mapped in real time, along with the high altitude assets and satellite assets that covered this entire battle space. As the light combined arms battalions comprising companies were now pushing deep into Orange. They now arrived into the heart of the city as the two companies moving through the city proper were now reaching their objectives by 6 a.m. as between 5 and 6 they advanced into Orange just as their combat engineer company peeled off to capture the Entergy Sabine power plant, which that operation likewise had begun at 6 a.m. And now by 6 a.m., if we go to the map of the heart of the city, within this 1.5 mile east to west by 1 mile north to south map, as the two companies moving through the heart of the city were arriving into this area, they were now immediately within range of their two primary objectives in this area, which were the capture intact of the Entergy Sabine power plant headquarters building, compound, office complex, and the I-10 highway segment which ran through this portion of the city, as the two additional Marine amphibious infantry companies that were advancing north were to the west of this area, approximately a mile away on the edge of the city, and also 2 miles to the east of this area on the easternmost edge of the city, and were now arriving at their objectives as the easternmost company of the Light Combined Arms Battalion was capturing the Sabine River I-10 bridge, while the westernmost company off the map was capturing the outer edges of the city of the I-10 segment that ran in and out of Orange, as effectively they would control the entry and exit to this node from the outside of it, while the two other companies advancing into the heart of the city would see the actual combat as the over 200 armed reactionary civilians, having had gradually fled north through the city, had now moved into this residential area as well as this commercial area, as the spread out city of Orange had several tributaries running through it in the form of canals and rivers. They also were spaced out by a number of empty lots and park like areas, as this was a relatively widely spread out city, although it was lightly populated. It was nearly 7 miles north to south and 4 miles east to west in terms of the city's total area. And as this working class neighborhood had already taken previously 82 millimeter mortar strikes on some of its housing blocks, as armed civilians had been seen moving through the area, an airstrike carried out by an Su-34 had also occurred in this area, where two 1,000-pound munitions had been dropped on this business, and having had destroyed it, badly damaged buildings on the other side of the streets, and also this building here on the other side of its parking lot, having had badly gutted the facades of these buildings, including this hotel. This would aid in the breaching of this building by a dismounted squad, as this company, moving in a staggered column formation of vehicles, with its 3 combat platoons and its headquarters platoon, which were the command and logistical elements of this whole company, were moving up as this double staggered column of vehicles. And on the other side of this map, this company had broken into its 3 combat platoons, moving up these 3 different streets, leaving behind its headquarters platoon to conduct logistical operations by trucking ammunition or fuel forward, and also commanding their company from behind them. As they moved gradually forward, this platoon had dismounted one of its 5 squads from one of their APCs to guard the flanks and provide mutual support between the vehicles and this squad. As this squad had been dismounted from this squad would guard the flanks of this platoon and their own platoon, and this platoon had dismounted 2 of their 5 squads to cover their flanks. As this area included a business park, which included the Entergy Sabine Power Plant headquarters building, as these were fences. This was an office complex as well. This was a shop. This is a gas station. These were all apartment complexes and buildings, and this was a working class residential neighborhood of working class homes. And these were big box stores. There was a restaurant and a hotel, and there were other restaurants and businesses located throughout this area. And then, of course, there was the hospital with its multi-floor parking garage, which, again, in terms of civil structures, is usually a relatively safe place to withstand heavy barrages of artillery and certain other munitions. And as a very punishing Su-34 strike would be carried out on this parking garage and its immediately surrounding areas, causing extensive damage to this building on the hospital campus and the facades of this hospital. The top 2 floors of the parking garage would be completely smashed, but the bottom 2 floors would survive, as 80 personnel located on the first level hiding in the parking garage would end up after this airstrike trying to flee out of this immediate area, where they would be seen, of course, by the quadcopter, high altitude, and satellite assets and mapped in real time as they were seen fleeing, and they would be permitted to cross the I-10 highway segment just off this map. And as they would get half a kilometer away or 500 meters away from the highway, the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would put together another pre-prepared strike package for an Su-34 to drop 4,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions on this group of 80 fleeing personnel. As the 5 that were on the roof of this building surveying this battlefield, upon seeing the PLAN Marines coming up this boulevard across this now flattened building, would flee into the roof access of the hospital building and eventually cross the street to this building across the street from the hospital. At the opening of this map, as the mortar company within the Light Combined Arms Battalion was also getting pre-prepared strike packages passed down to their FDC elements by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system in real time. Many mortar strikes were now unfolding at the opening of this map, as it's now 6 a.m. when this map opens up, and the 2 PLAN Marine amphibious infantry companies out of the total of 4 that were advancing north into Orange, as again, there was 1 to the east and off this map to capture the Sabine River Highway Bridge of I-10, and the other to capture the outskirts of I-10 in the city of Orange. It would only be these 2 companies that would see combat inside of the city, and the combat would be extensive and it would be heavy, as the armed civilian forces, both the armed militia type civilians that were now entering the town looking for a fight with the invading forces, and the standard fare of armed reactionary civilians, would be brutally put down as they tried to put up heavy resistance against the invasion forces. There would be some that were equipped with Molotov cocktails by this point, but none of them would be able to carry out a successful attack against the PLAN Marine forces in this particular operation, as it was still, again, relatively early in the grand scope and scale of the overall invasion. There were still many of these armed reactionary civilians that were woefully naive to the situation they now faced, and they were woefully unprepared for the fight that lay ahead as these PLAN Marine companies advanced into the heart of the city. As this particular hotel contained a group of 20 armed reactionary civilians that had fled north and into this building, they would effectively be taken out by 2 squads from the 3rd Combat Platoon of this company, as eventually all platoons, in terms of the combat platoons, would be dropped off in terms of the dismounts of the squads from each vehicle, as initially these two squads from the 3rd Combat Platoon of this whole company were clearing the flanks of the advance of their vehicle column as they drove north. And as this squad breached this building and begun to take fire from the personnel inside, as the vehicles moved up, they laid down supporting fire on the upper floors of the hotel while they dismounted another squad from 3rd Platoon to go in and assist this squad in clearing the 20 defenders out of this building, as they would break into their stack teams, as the two squads would break into half squads. The 4 total stack teams of the 2 squads would methodically move through the hotel, clearing hallway by hallway, room by room, and office by office as they went through this hotel. Eventually, one squad would remain on the lower level of this building to defend the lower level so that the other squad could take positions on the roof and begin to lay down fire into this area to support the advance of these forces to capture the Entergy Sabine power plant. As one platoon from this company that was to the west of this company would assist in the capture of the Entergy Sabine power plant objective, as the power plant headquarters complex was again a major objective as it contained assets that were critical to the running of the actual power plant that was located miles away from the city of Orange. As this company was advancing, mortar strikes had already been coming in at the opening of this map, as these vehicles, these technicals with armed civilians in them, were trying to race down these streets and out of parking areas where they had temporarily tried to rendezvous to come up with contingency plans, as this was a very disorganized defensive operation on the part of the armed civilians. They were seen and struck by ISR-directed mortar strikes, as the pre-prepared strike packages from the ISR data were sent down from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and multiple mortar strikes were fired against these technicals and the personnel inside of them. As this grouping of vehicles, this convoy, were all armed reactionary civilian militia forces. Each technical, which was a pickup truck in this case, carried roughly 8 militia personnel each. And as they moved down this boulevard, at first relatively cautiously, but then they begun to speed down the boulevard, they now had begun to take 30mm autocannon fire from the lead IFV of this platoon, as well as also 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from the turret gunner, as this heavy firepower shredded through multiple technicals and blasted them into twisted hulks of smoking metal, along with body parts of the shredded up personnel that were in them. This airstrike had come in at the same time, as this Su-34 dropped a punishing load of 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions on this apartment complex, and surrounding buildings would be horribly gutted in their facades as the munitions landed in this area and destroyed all of these buildings. As these vehicles were trying to flee early on at the same time this airstrike was coming in, mortar strikes had come in and destroyed all of these fleeing technicals. As these would be destroyed by the airstrike, this one was trying to flee, as was this one, this one, this one, and this one, and this one, but they were all hit by repeated mortar strikes into this area. By that time, these dismounts had made it up onto this overpass of I-10 and would temporarily take position here, but would end up being engaged later by this platoon of vehicles moving through the area. Initially, as this squad from this platoon and this squad also from this platoon moved into these buildings, they begun to lay down fire to support the advance of their vehicles, who also laid down fire on these militia vehicles, who the tail end of this convoy was smashed in the airstrike, while the lead vehicles were shredded up by the 30mm autocannon fire and 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from the turret gunner of the lead IFV. As these platoons had staggered weapons to cover different areas of approach around their vehicles, they therefore had 360-degree security around their vehicle columns, as on their flanks, the squads advanced through these homes, which would all be cleared at a later time, as for the time being, the forces moving in this area were only concerned with what had already been seen moving in this battle space. As if they were to take any fire from any homes, they would of course return fire, but they were mostly concerned with all the forces that had already been mapped in real time by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system according to all the gathered ISR data, and had already been seen in which buildings they had been moving into, and therefore, as these forces cautiously moved through the area, they now advanced towards their different objectives. As this platoon moved toward this area, they were laying down heavy fire on the defending forces in these sandbag emplacements, which were also trying to fire back at this big box store, which was a one-floor building, but it was a tall building as it was a big box store. And out of the entryways of this building, they were laying down fire through the fencing against the sandbag emplacement, who was returning fire against them, and then the vehicles were laying down fire into this general area. As in this parking lot, there were defending forces trying to run through the parking area to get to fortified areas. They were hit by mortar strikes promptly, including the sandbag emplacement, and this area here between the buildings and the sandbag emplacement guarding the rear entryway. They too were hit by repeated mortar strikes, as the headquarters platoon of this company, which was just off the map, had two of their specially trained drone operators fire the single-tube versions of the CH-901A loitering munitions, these being equipped with the fragmentation warheads. These were now orbiting the battle space on AI target-seeking mode, looking for critical targets of opportunity, especially targets on high elevations, such as these 5 paramilitary defenders on the roof of the office building, the main building here. As there were 120 paramilitary defenders inside the building that would have to be cleared out of it, the 5 on the roof were trying to make for the roof access when one of the 2 loitering munitions would slam into and destroy all of them with a fragmentation warhead. This grouping running through the back parking lot as this vehicle column advanced and had dropped off 2 more squads into this building and this building on their flanks, making the entire 3rd platoon now dropped off. These forces tried to lay down fire into this vehicle column, who also, besides laying down fire into these personnel with the troops on the roof on this hotel laying down fire, after having had cleared the 20 defenders out, this loitering munition, besides the one that hit the forces on the roof, would crash into and destroy these forces in conjunction with all of the fire being laid into them, as a mortar had already since struck these 2 technicals with armed personnel in them early in the operation. As this squad was laying down supporting fire, as was this squad on the roof of the hotel into this area, and the vehicles now moving forward, with this squad having moved into this building would end up getting into a firefight with this grouping, which was roughly a squad-sized element of armed civilians that had moved into this building, then raced across the parking lot and entered this building. An exchange of fire would begin between the squad and this grouping here, where this squad would end up firing 35mm tube-fired grenades from beneath one of the rifles of one of the troops into this building, these were 2 fast food places, and also small arms fire, and eventually a rocket-propelled grenade from a Type 69 RPG, before then continuing to lay down suppressing fire with a stack team, or half a squad, with the other half squad forming a stack team and clearing the building, with then the rest of the squad following behind, as this firefight would last roughly 15 minutes. By that time, the vehicles are now advancing towards their ultimate objectives, which were the capture of the headquarters of the Entergy Sabine power plant and this segment of I-10, which ran through this battle space. As the mortars had struck these technicals, leaving the hospital parking area and on the street, as well as on this street, the 5 personnel that had already fled would end up becoming prisoners of war, as they would be captured later, as they would end up running into the forces holding the Sabine River I-10 bridge, as it was the only crossing point across the Sabine River that was left that hadn't been struck by cruise missile strikes early on, and they would attempt to cross this bridge but then run into the defenders that had now taken control of it, which were the PLAN Marine Amphibious Infantry Company that had been tasked with taking that objective from the Light Combined Arms Battalion, as again, this grouping of 80 would be hit by an 34 airstrike after getting 500 meters away to the north of I-10 as they fled out of this battle space, this being the helipad for the hospital, as they had a helipad for their critical care patients that were air evac'd by helicopter. They would move through this area off the map and be hit by an additional Su-34 airstrike, as the devastating strike that had hit the apartment complexes had annihilated hundreds of armed reactionary civilians between the vehicles and the personnel that were in this particular area, as there were 80 in this apartment block, 40 in this block, and then dozens of dismounted and mounted up personnel. All of these vehicles and those in the buildings were completely annihilated in this punishing Su-34 airstrike. By then, these vehicles were on the move, moving into this area, along with their dismounted squads, which were advancing cautiously, block by block, with the vehicles. As this squad from this platoon would end up advancing into this gutted apartment block here, with the facade having been effectively crumbled, they would have a half squad monitoring this area while these vehicles were moving through the entryway, and then the other half squad monitoring this office complex from this building. As this squad would move into position here, they would get into a diamond formation where they would be able to monitor all directions of approach, as this squad would take position in this building and watch to the west, as all of these would have mutually supporting fields of fire, as the squad would be supported from the back by this diamond formation watching down these streets and these areas here. This squad would watch this direction, and this squad would watch these areas while their vehicles were laying down heavy fire and entering the complex from its front gate. As the gatehouse had two paramilitary personnel attempting to flee, they were savagely cut down by heavy machine gun fire from the follow-up APC that was right behind the lead IFV, while the lead IFV laid down fire into this building as they were taking fire from some of the windows on the upper levels, as there were 30 defenders in this ancillary building, while the main building had 120 spread throughout it, as the column of vehicles of this whole company were now forging ahead. As they stopped in this area, they laid down heavy machine gun fire into this building as they were taking fire from the windows, and as they dismounted a whole platoon, as this arrow was actually 3 squads right here, they would race into this building under the cover of their vehicle-based fire, lighting up the upper windows, as they were only using heavy machine gun fire from the vehicles and not the more powerful IFV-based weaponry like the 30mm autocannon, as that would have done too much damage to the building. They simply only lit up the personnel that fired out at them from windows, while their troops breached the bottom entryways of the building, as these 2 squads would clear this building. By that time, these vehicles had entered this office compound, and there being a total of 8 of these technicals had dropped off all of their dismounts from their technicals, which the technicals were then hit by repeated mortar strikes, as these 2 squad-sized elements of 8 personnel each of armed civilian militia forces had been dropped off, as again, there's 4 in this cab, and then there's 3 in the back, but these carried 8, as there would have been 4 in the back and 4 in the cab. They had been dropped off in this office complex, and 2 squad-sized forces were firing and exchanging fire with the 2 squads that cleared this building, as they were lit up by rocket-propelled grenade fire, 35mm tube-fired grenades, as they were within range for it, just within range across the fence, and also rocket-propelled grenades with anti-personnel ammunition, and even an HJ-08 ATGM being fired at one of the technicals from one of the squads in this building, before then entering and breaching this building with their 30 defenders after wiping these personnel out in conjunction with mortar strikes that were ISR directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And as the platoon here was laying down supporting fire into this building, eventually the fire would cease into the building as these squads had breached from the other side, as they would then redirect fire over into this area and into this area here, as when they breached, they had laid down heavy fire into these sandbag emplacements in front of the front entryway and wiped these personnel out, before dismounting a squad to hold a position and field of fire outside of the buildings on the side of their lead infantry fighting vehicle. As they were in a wedge formation, they could watch this direction and the upper floors of this building if need be, along with the vehicle, the lead IFV, while the armored personnel carriers watched this direction, they watched the rear, and they watched this direction as they had staggered weapons. And as these two squads breached the front entryway, 3 from this platoon that had been dropped off to enter from the back breached from this direction. So a total of 50 personnel from 5 squads total, 2 coming from the front, 3 coming from the back, were now clearing the 120 defenders from this critical objective inside the building, going hallway by hallway, room by room, office by office, lobby by lobby, closet by closet, clearing the entire critical facility. As certain munitions would even be off limits for certain areas of the building, which included hand grenades and 35mm grenades and rocket-propelled grenades and ATGMs, the stack teams, which were of course well armored with their body armor and Kevlars, would effectively have no problem clearing out the defending forces, although it would take time as this was a large building and there was a sizable number of defending paramilitary forces that were within it. As they went through the building methodically, it would take them several hours to fully clear the complex, as they had, again, certain items, certain weapons that were off limits for their use according to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which guided many of these precision operations as these forces moved through the building. As outside of the building, heavy combat was still occurring as 2 squads from the 1st platoon had been deployed into this building, as the whole of the 2nd platoon was deployed to capture this complex, with this platoon from the other company entering from the front. The 1st platoon deployed 2 of their squads into this building to guard the flanks of the vehicle's advance as they pursued their final objective, moving to take I-10 in this segment of the city, of this node. As they continued moving with their vehicle column, they dropped off 2 more squads from the 1st platoon, the 1st combat platoon, with 1 squad going into this building to be able to watch this segment of the highway, while this squad would watch this segment, while also simultaneously guarding the right flank of these vehicles of this column, which all had staggered weapons and could mutually support the forces in the buildings. And as they got to their final destination, they dropped off the last squad of the 1st platoon and 2 headquarters platoon squads for good measure to watch this area, watch the underpass of this highway overpass here, and to watch the highway segment with the troops in these buildings and their vehicles with staggered weapons. As these personnel were inside of these buildings by now, as the 2 squad-sized elements that dismounted and exchanged fire briefly with these squads were destroyed, there was fire being exchanged from in this office building against the 2 squads after having had cleared these 30 defenders out of this building, would briefly exchange fire with personnel in this building, while this platoon from this company was by this point moving through this area to breach this compound after all the vehicles had been destroyed by repeated mortar strikes and fire from the troops, the 2 squads in this building, and before having it entered this building to return fire back and forth between the squads in this building and the 2 squads now in control of this building after first clearing the 30 defenders. As there were 5 squad-sized elements that entered this building and 1 that entered this smaller building, this platoon, having had moved through the area, now breaching this office complex that was beside this gas station and this shop just to the south, would dismount their 4 remaining squads, 1 squad to take this building from this squad-sized element of about 8 militia-type personnel, and then 3 squads to clear this larger building of 5 squad-sized elements of militia personnel. Effectively, 40 militia personnel were in this building at this point, and 30 Marines would clear the building. As they had taken fire from the building, they had laid down suppressing fire from their vehicle, from their lead IFV, using their W-85 heavy machine gun to return fire into the windows of the office building to allow for these squads to breach, while the other vehicles with staggered weapons likewise laid suppressing fire into this building, as one of the armor personnel carriers, EBD-05s, had its turret trained on this building to allow this squad to breach as they watched the upper floors. And they remained alert outside of these buildings while their squads now methodically went through clearing out these defenders. As all their technicals had all been destroyed by now, these squads that were in these buildings now had to be cleared out by this platoon, having had moved up through the area, as this squad again was in a diamond formation, and this squad took position in this gutted building from the airstrike and watched the west. This squad in a diamond could watch all avenues of approach, as this diamond was an excellent formation for watching the rear of these buildings while they can mutually support one another with their fields of fire. As this squad watched the west, they watched the back of this building and this approach here, while this squad could watch this direction, and this squad in this building watched this direction and this direction while these operations were underway to provide support while this platoon entered this office complex and this platoon entered the headquarters. And all of these forces, with mutual supporting fields of fire, were able to carry out a tactical masterstroke of this operation. With this platoon of vehicles, now that these forces held all these avenues of approach, including here, this platoon of vehicles continued to advance through this massively bomb-damaged area with all of these flattened piles of rubble that used to be large apartment buildings. By getting to this point, this grouping that had taken position on the bridge temporarily had moved into the area and challenged this lead infantry fighting vehicle. By the time they crossed the barrier, the median of the highway, and got onto this exit ramp, they were exchanging fire with the lead IFV, which locked onto them with the 30mm autocannon and blew them to pieces, as the HE armor-piercing ammunition was far too much for this group to withstand, and they were shredded to pieces, and were also struck with precision mortar strikes carried out by the mortar company, who had been constantly laying down heavy supporting mortar fire throughout this entire area, and even certain areas beyond with the rocket-assisted ammunition, which included even this parking area, as several armed civilian personnel had been hit by a mortar strike in this area as they were trying to move in to act as a sort of reinforcement to all the other armed civilians that were known to be congregating in this area. This grouping of technicals, of course, being destroyed along with these forces having had fled from the first floor of the building. These technicals parked on the top, along with these personnel watching the area, have been destroyed by this devastating Su-34 strike at the opening of the battle, leaving very few remaining enemy personnel to contend with, apart from those that were inside of the Entergy Sabine Power Plant headquarters building, as well as those now being cleared out inside of the neighboring office building, as the stack teams were methodically going through these areas and clearing out the defenders. There was nowhere they could hide, as every nook and cranny and every corner of these buildings were checked for defenders by these stack teams as they methodically moved through this office complex and the main objective, the Entergy Sabine Power Plant headquarters complex itself. As now, the segment of I-10 that traversed through this part of the city, in the heart of the city, was now under watch by the dismounted squads taking positions in these buildings as well as their vehicles, and also this grouping, after having had annihilated these challengers, now moved to this highway underpass and had its troops, its remaining 4 squads, mounted up to be dismounted at any point in time if needed, while the vehicles kept watch over this highway segment, while this company kept watch over this highway segment through this area, as they now controlled the heart of the city, as they had effectively cleared it by this point, moving through this area with the ISR mapping of the area in real time, guiding their movements through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as all the enemy forces were seen in real time, and wherever they were was where forces were deployed to handle them, which included on the flanks of the advance of their vehicles. Now that they had captured this critical segment of I-10 through the heart of the city and were in the process of completing their operation to capture the Entergy Sabine Power Plant headquarters, the J-10 aircraft were now in the process of returning to their original bases, as they were now going back to reload with predominantly air to ground munitions to be able to add massively additional striking power to the already massively formidable and devastating Su 34 strike aircraft, as each Su 34, with its 26,000-pound air to ground munition bomb load, was simply a level of destruction beyond imagination, as they were almost as devastating as some heavy bombers even were, as they carried such a massive payload. Even as powerful as the JH-7 of the PLAAF or the Chinese Air Force was, the Su-34, with its additional 6,000 pounds each, was simply a monster in terms of a strike aircraft. And as now the Su-34 strikes, having had flattened parts of the city, had annihilated a sizable chunk of the defenders in the city of Orange, as now the remaining defenders of paramilitary forces were now being mopped up. Eventually, by 9 a.m., the Entergy Sabine Power Plant headquarters would be captured, and one of the stack teams of the 5 squads would move to the roof of the facility and plant the CCP regime party flag and the national flag of China over the building to signify its capture, as this objective would be taken. As also, the casualties would be relatively light on the PLAN side in this battle, as they would have approximately 8 wounded personnel and 2 KIAs, which most of which would occur in the capture of these 2 office complexes, while the forces that were operating outside effectively had 0 casualties, and the forces taking this building as well, as these armed civilians trying to hold this building were no challenge whatsoever at all, nor were those in this building, as the heavy firepower deployed by this squad was simply too much, with 35mm grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, and their small arms being tactically levied against these personnel as they broke into 2 stack teams, one laying suppressing fire and the other breaching, taking the building, with the other half squad following behind. As the strike on the hospital was a mammoth airstrike as well, destroying the top 2 floors and wiping out all the personnel at the street level, badly damaging parts of the hospital as well. With those 80 personnel that had fled, again being hit by a follow-up Su-34 airstrike, the vast majority of the defending American forces, which numbered a total of 500 armed reactionary civilians and, of course, the 200 paramilitary defenders, most of which were all KIAs, although there was a small handful of prisoners of war taken, including these 5 eventually being captured as they ran towards the other company holding the Sabine River I-10 bridge. Some would surrender inside of the compound, which would be wounded personnel that were no longer capable of putting up any effective resistance against the Marines, the PLAN Marines, and would give up, with several surrendering in this building as well, being militia personnel, the rest of which would effectively all be wiped out. As medical care, of course, would be rendered to the wounded American prisoners of war by the PLAN Marine combat medics, they would be sent to the headquarters platoons of each company as they would establish their POW and casualty collection points after attaining their objectives, as the headquarters platoon of this company, originally left behind the combat platoons, would now advance to the highway bridge and set up their temporary command post, and after which, as this fighting died down and this battle was effectively won by the Marines of the Light Combined Arms Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, would eventually delegate some of the different platoons to check each and every building for any holdouts throughout the city, which would take a number of hours, but it would be achieved as the entire key node of the city of Orange would be cleared of any and all defending forces. As most of the ordinary civilian population of Orange had by now long since either fled or went into hiding, there were also armed civilians who were non reactionary and opted to flee to try to get better organized as they ran into the hinterlands of the rural areas of this battle space and beyond, as by now many millions of armed civilians and unarmed civilians alike had fled into the wilderness to escape from this horrendous invasion, as the pounding of artillery, tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, and, of course, airstrikes and strategic bombing raids, and more, was tearing the nation to pieces. And the thunderous cacophony of all of these munitions was simply too much to bear for the average American civilian who by now was terrified and in pure raw panic and taken to flight in a hurry as they fled, and they fled as fast as their legs or their vehicles would carry them out of the battle spaces. As this was happening nationwide, this ended up being a catastrophe for the American Armed Forces, which also included its paramilitary alphabet elements, and also for the civilian population as they watched their defenses disintegrate all around them, as they were simply no match for fourth generation warfare doctrines, nor for the highly advanced and massively firepower dominant forces that carried out these doctrines, which in this particular battle space featured the forces of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. As this somewhat quasi-elite force ran roughshod over this part of the country, simply annihilating all in their wake with their firepower, tactical, ISR, IT, and AI dominance, as the Americans, for their part, had been effectively sent back into the Stone Age, as they had lost all ISR, IT, and other capabilities to the tandem anti-satellite cyberstrike, along with, of course, also the local usage in many battle spaces of the very potent electronic warfare jamming assets of the coalition. As the combat occurring in Orange between 6 and 9 a.m. was unfolding, there were many other combat operations unfolding throughout the rest of the battle space in conjunction with these operations, as the PLAN Marines that were of the Light Combined Arms Battalion were capturing the critical objectives in Orange, as well as also the actual Entergy Sabine power plant itself. The troops, the Marines of the Recon Battalion, were conducting important operations of their own as well, as by now, of course, by 5 a.m., they had reached Vidor and had conducted preliminary reconnaissance before establishing a line of contact along I-10 and State Highway 12 to prevent an emerging militia force of 750 American militia elements in Vidor from being able to threaten the rear flank of the company that was dispatched of their battalion to guard the I-10 highway bridge from Beaumont, between Beaumont and Vidor, as the three recon companies, having had mopped up these armed reactionary civilians while the rest had advanced to Vidor, were now falling in behind. They would move to reinforce the company holding the bridge. So there would be 4 companies guarding the bridge, with the other 3 recon companies and the headquarters and support company sitting back behind them, providing logistics and command support, would prevent these militia elements from threatening the rear flank of the securing of the bridge, as the Air Assault Battalion had secured the other 2 major crossing points, as the cruise missile strikes from the Renhai class guided missile cruisers and the Yuan class subs had removed most of the key bridges in the area, leaving very few left. All of the critical choke points in and out of Beaumont were now fully under PLAN control, including the I-10 bridge in and out of Beaumont on its eastern side, as the operation to fix these forces in place was being carried out by elements of the Recon Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. The Medium Combined Arms Battalion, having already had secured a large segment of I-10 between Vidor and Orange, was now advancing into Vidor on the flanks of these forces, who, for their part, were using every advantage they had in terms of defense, which included using local buildings and basements and sewers and drainage tunnels, as well as also storm shelters or storm cellars and other local wooded areas for defense against the attacking PLAN Marines of both the Recon Battalion and the Medium Combined Arms Battalion coming in to flush them out, as they would hit them on their flanks, moving into Vidor from the east, moving westward. Upon having had destroyed these defending forces, the Medium Combined Arms Battalion sitting in Vidor would be in an excellent position to provide support to the operations either unfolding in Beaumont or being able to clear out any appearing enemy forces on the periphery of the city if required, while they would also be available as a reinforcement again for the operations unfolding in Beaumont, as they would then be able to cross the I-10 bridge, having had been secured earlier by the Recon battalions comprising components, as again, the first company to arrive would secure the bridge, with the 3 remaining, having had earlier destroyed this cluster of armed civilians, would emerge and reinforce them. Although this would not necessarily be required, the Medium Combined Arms Battalion would at least be sitting in a good position to be able to help if need be, although again, they would not be required to do so. But the operation to capture and clear Vidor was a very brutal operation, as the artillery fire provided from the artillery battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would be savage indeed, as the artillery forces were conducting a phased advance to a new firing point, which meant that remaining batteries would continue firing on different targets, while each battery would pack up and move, set up, and continue firing on the same targets, while the last batteries would then pack up and then join them and continue firing. As they conducted this phased advance, they would continually lay down heavy fire support to support the operation in Vidor, the main operation to capture the critical objectives inside of Beaumont, which even included the entire I-10 segment, being carried out by the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion, both of which sweeping north into the city. The artillery would support them and their operations as well throughout the course of the entire campaign, as they would also support the 2 air assault infantry marine companies holding this critical segment of I-10, the I-10 bridge in the southwest of Beaumont. They would support them against the multiple attacks and even counterattacks that were actually planned by armed reactionary civilians against the forces holding the bridge. With this massively heavy artillery fire support and also continual air support, the attacks from the armed reactionary civilian elements would be rendered effectively useless, as they would be continually attacked. The PLAN Marines would hold firm and continue to maintain these critical positions at these massively important choke points. Not to mention as well that I-10 was also a critical major invasion route of key importance according to the 4th generation warfare doctrines, as it would be used by the external components to eventually move through this battle space to get to the American southeast, and thus holding the entire route, including its key bridges, was of the utmost importance to the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. As the Vidor battle would last a number of hours, just as the fighting did in Orange, the fighting in Vidor would effectively last between 5 and 10 a.m., as this 5-hour battle would initiate by the recon Marines, effectively establishing their line of contact after conducting reconnaissance, with the Medium Combined Arms Battalion arriving by 6 a.m. and clearing Vidor by 10 a.m., as this was effectively one large flank clearance operation, in a sense. This area had to absolutely be cleared of enemy defending forces, as it was along I-10, again, a major critical invasion route of similar importance to I-35, for example, as this invasion route led into the American Southeast, or the Southeastern Invasion Sector, from the South Central Invasion Sector, and clearing Vidor as a node along this route was of critical importance, as the battle in Vidor will be covered in the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. As this entire operation was underway, the air assault, or the air defense, the SHORAD battalion, rather, the air defense battalion, lacking air targets, with their armored Yitian SHORAD air defense artillery vehicles, would now be providing combat escort duties for the support battalion and their logistical transport companies, driving supplies from the Port Arthur port to the frontline units carrying out the fighting, as the support battalion trucked their supplies to the headquarters and support company of each combat battalion, which in turn would truck supplies to the headquarters platoons of each combat company within their battalion. As that logistical system was now fully up and running, the Air Assault Battalion had a separate logistical system, as their transport aviation company could fly supplies from their Typo 75 helicopter landing dock or helicopter carrier out to the Air Assault Marines holding their different positions. The Combat Aviation Company within the Air Assault Battalion was still flying support operations in the north, as there were tiny, small-scale attacks against the forces holding this bridge being carried out by tiny groups of armed reactionary civilians by this point in time, by 6 a.m. And these combat aviation elements of the Air Assault Battalion, chiefly the helicopters, the Z-9WA Hilo gunships of the battalion's combat aviation company, would lay down heavy 23mm fire and also ATGM and 70mm rocket fire into these enemy forces, as they would support the two Air Assault Infantry Marine companies holding the 96 State Highway Bridge crossing, as well as also the 82mm mortar company providing mortar support to the two Air Assault Marine Infantry companies holding that area. As the Battle of Vidor was now in full swing by 6 a.m., the fighting again in this area would be extensive, and it would be heavy. More to come in the next installation.